If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. Paper route tragedy. I was 13 when it happened. Delivering papers was my first real job, and I took it seriously, even if it meant getting up before dawn. That morning was cold and quiet, with the kind of eerie stillness that makes every sound sharper. I had just finished folding the last paper on my bike's basket when I heard the first gunshot. It was loud, so loud that it felt like it shook the air around me. At first, I thought it was a car backfiring, but then a second shot echoed through the neighborhood. My heart started racing. This wasn't normal. The streets were empty, the houses dark, and that silence afterward was heavier than anything I'd felt before. I froze in place for what felt like minutes, trying to convince myself I hadn't just heard gunshots. My hands were trembling as I gripped the handlebars of my bike. I looked down the street toward the sound, but nothing moved. I thought about going home, but I didn't want to get in trouble for skipping my route. So, I told myself it was probably nothing and pedaled toward the next house. The closer I got to the sound, though, the more uneasy I felt. My stomach churned, and every nerve in my body was screaming at me to turn around. But curiosity won out, like it always does at that age. I decided to follow the noise. As I pedaled further, the sound of my tires crunching against the gravel felt unbearably loud. I reached the corner of Oakwood Drive, where the houses were spaced further apart, their big yards filled with dark silhouettes of trees and shrubs. That's when I saw it. One of the porch lights was still on, but the front door was wide open. Something about it felt off. It wasn't just open a crack, it was swung fully open, like someone had stormed out or left in a hurry. My throat tightened. I thought about calling out, but the words got stuck in my throat. Instead, I stopped in the middle of the street, my bike wobbling under me, and just stared. That's when I noticed something in the driveway, something small and dark, almost blending into the shadows. My stomach dropped when I realized it was a pair of shoes. Not just tossed aside, but lying like someone had fallen out of them. I don't know why, but seeing those shoes made everything feel too real. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped my bike when I got off to take a closer look. I crept toward the edge of the driveway, straining my eyes in the dim light, and that's when I smelled it. A metallic, sickly sweet scent that I'd only ever heard described in books or movies. Blood. The smell hit me harder than I expected, making my stomach churn. I stumbled back, suddenly hyper-aware of how exposed I was standing there in the open. My brain was screaming at me to get out of there, but I couldn't move. That's when I saw the trail. It started near the shoes and led up the driveway toward the porch. It wasn't a perfect line, more like splatters and smears, but it was unmistakable. My hands were clammy, and I remember wiping them on my jacket over and over, even though it didn't help. I was shaking, but some part of me had to know what happened. I crept closer, each step feeling like it might be my last. The porch light cast everything in this weird yellowish glow, making the scene feel even more surreal. That's when I saw them. Two bodies, crumpled just inside the door. One was a man, lying face down, and the other was a boy around my age. He was slumped against the wall, his head tilted at a weird angle. I didn't even need to check to know they were both dead. The gun was still in the man's hand. I couldn't stop staring at the boy, though. He was wearing a hoodie with some band logo on it, the kind of thing I'd probably see a kid at school wearing. That's what made it hit me. He wasn't some stranger. He could have been someone I passed in the halls every day. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away, my feet scraping against the concrete. I didn't even realize I was crying until I felt the cold air sting my cheeks. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but my legs felt like jelly. I just stood there, staring at the open door, the gun, the bodies. It felt like time had stopped. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a piece of paper lying just a few feet away. It looked like it had been ripped out of a notebook, the edges jagged. Against every instinct telling me to leave, I stepped closer and crouched down to read it. The note was short, scrawled in uneven handwriting. It said something like, "I can't let my son live this way. God forgive me." My stomach dropped, and the world around me spun. I didn't understand everything in that moment, but I could piece together enough. The boy, his son, was dead because of this. Because of whatever way the man thought he couldn't accept. I felt sick. My chest was tight, and my hands were shaking so bad I thought I'd drop the paper. I looked back at the boy again, his lifeless face frozen in what looked like fear or pain, and I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted. I don't think I've ever pedaled so fast in my life. The cold air burned my lungs, and my legs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop. I didn't even care that I was leaving half the newspapers undelivered. All I could think about was getting as far away from that house as possible. By the time I got home, the sun was starting to rise, casting this dull, gray light over everything. I threw my bike on the lawn and stumbled inside, barely able to catch my breath. My mom was already awake, making coffee in the kitchen. She looked up, startled, when she saw me. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice sharp with concern. I wanted to tell her everything, but the words wouldn't come out. My throat felt tight, and I was shaking so hard I couldn't stop. All I could say was, "Something bad happened." She frowned, but before she could press me, we both heard the faint wail of sirens in the distance. It was like they'd been chasing me, getting closer and closer. My mom turned to the window, her face pale, and I saw her piece it together. "Stay here," she said, grabbing her phone. But I didn't stay. I went to my room, shut the door, and sat on my bed, trying to block out the noise. I kept seeing the boy's face, the note, the gun. It was like they were burned into my brain. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The police swarmed the neighborhood, and I could hear snippets of conversation from outside as neighbors gathered, trying to piece together what had happened. My mom eventually came to my room, asking if I wanted to talk, but I just shook my head. I couldn't tell her. Not yet. I couldn't even bring myself to say the words out loud. I stayed in my room for hours, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my head. The gunshots, the smell, the note. I kept wondering if I could have done something. What if I had knocked on a door for help? What if I hadn't frozen when I saw the bodies? But then I'd remember the man's note, and I'd feel this deep, awful weight in my chest. It wasn't my fault. None of it was. But it still felt like it. By the time the sun set, I thought I might finally get some relief. I was exhausted, but every time I closed my eyes, I'd see the boy's face again. Around midnight, I finally broke. I sat up, grabbed my phone, and started typing everything into a note. Everything I saw, everything I felt. I didn't know if I'd ever share it with anyone, but writing it down felt like the only way to make sense of it. As I typed, I kept going back to that one question. Why? Why would a father do something like that? Why couldn't he just let his son be who he was? I didn't have an answer then, and I still don't now. All I know is that it's haunted me every day since. The next morning, I heard from my mom that the news had already spread through the neighborhood. She didn't know I had been there, nobody did, but she told me what the police had shared. The boy, Michael, was 15. He'd recently come out to his family, and according to some of the neighbors, his dad hadn't taken it well. They said there were arguments, shouting matches that people could hear through the walls. The police were calling it a murder-suicide, but they didn't share many details publicly. I didn't need them to. I'd seen enough. To this day, I still feel a weird knot in my chest whenever I pass that house. It's been years, but I'll always remember how it felt to be standing there, staring into the kind of horror that you don't think exists in real life. I've never told anyone what I saw, not my mom, not my friends, not even my therapist. Maybe I'm scared of how they'd react, or maybe I just don't want to relive it more than I already do. Sometimes I think about Michael, and I wonder if he knew how much he mattered, even if his dad couldn't see it. I'll never get an answer to that, but I hope, wherever he is, that he's found the peace he didn't get in life. Blizzard driving nightmare. I don't think I've ever been as terrified as I was that day. I mean, I grew up in a place where snowstorms were just part of life, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened when I was learning to drive in the middle of a freaking blizzard. I was 16, barely confident behind the wheel, and my dad thought it'd be a good experience to take me out for some winter driving practice. He said it like it was no big deal, like we weren't about to face one of the worst whiteouts I've ever seen. The kind of snow where you can't see more than a few feet in front of the car. I thought he was joking when he handed me the keys that day, but nope, he was dead serious. We were on this backcountry road, the kind where there's nothing but empty fields on both sides, and it felt like we were the only ones stupid enough to be out there. The snow was coming down so hard that even with the wipers on full blast, I could barely see the road. And then there was the wind. It was howling, shaking the car like it was a toy. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight that my knuckles turned white. Every few seconds, my dad would give me pointers, like, ease off the gas when you feel the wheel slipping, or don't jerk the wheel if you lose control. But honestly, I could barely hear him over the pounding in my chest. All I could think was, what if I crash? What if we end up in a ditch and freeze out here? At some point, the road completely disappeared under the snow. I mean, it was like driving on a blank sheet of paper. My dad told me to keep an eye on the tree line to the right as a guide, but even that was barely visible through the blizzard. My stomach was in knots because I knew that one wrong move could send us sliding off the road, or worse, into oncoming traffic. Not that we'd seen another car in miles. The wind kept pushing the car sideways, and I could feel the tires struggling for grip. It felt like I was just guessing where the road might be and praying I didn't end up in a ditch. Then came the scariest moment. Out of nowhere, the back of the car started to fishtail. My heart shot up to my throat as the car swung to the side, the tires completely losing traction. My dad shouted, "Don't hit the brakes," but my reflexes betrayed me, and I tapped them anyway. That made everything worse. The car spun halfway around, and for a split second, all I could see out the windshield was a wall of white. It felt like time froze. My dad was yelling something. I don't even remember what, but I couldn't hear him over the sound of my own panic. The car finally came to a stop, angled across the road, the front bumper practically kissing a snowbank. I just sat there, gripping the wheel, shaking so hard I thought I might throw up. My dad was trying to stay calm, but I could tell even he was freaked out. Okay, he said, taking a deep breath. "We're fine. You're fine. Let's just get the car straightened out." Easier said than done. When I tried to turn the wheel, the tires just spun uselessly. We were stuck. I felt like crying, but I forced myself to focus as my dad talked me through rocking the car back and forth to get some traction. After what felt like forever, the tires finally caught, and we were moving again. My heart didn't stop racing though, and I couldn't stop glancing in the mirrors to make sure no other car was barreling toward us out of the storm. We kept going, but every second felt like a gamble. The road was so slick that even the tiniest mistake could have sent us spinning again. And then, out of nowhere, these headlights appeared behind us. I couldn't tell how far back they were because the snow distorted everything, but they seemed to be coming fast. My dad noticed them too and told me to keep to the right as much as I could. The car behind us got closer and closer, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. What kind of maniac drives that fast in a storm like this? They were practically on our bumper, their headlights so bright they lit up the inside of our car. I thought they were going to rear-end us any second. The car stayed right on us, and I could barely breathe. My dad kept saying, "Stay calm, stay steady," but I could hear the tension in his voice. The headlights were so blinding that I could hardly see the road in front of me. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they swerved into the oncoming lane. I thought, what the hell are they doing? But there wasn't even time to process it before they sped past us, their horn blaring. I swear, they must have been going 60 or 70 in conditions where even 30 felt dangerous. For a moment, I was just stunned. My dad muttered something under his breath, but I couldn't make it out. I kept driving, but now I was more rattled than ever, gripping the wheel so hard my fingers ached. We didn't see that car again, but something about it left me feeling uneasy, like there was something off. Maybe it was just the adrenaline, but the whole thing felt surreal. The storm seemed to get even worse after that. It was like we were trapped in a swirling vortex of snow, with no end in sight. I tried to focus on the road, but the wind was so strong it felt like it might blow us right off it. Then, as we came around a slight curve, I saw something in the distance. At first, it looked like just another snowbank, but as we got closer, my stomach dropped. It was the same car that had sped past us earlier, now halfway buried in a ditch, its headlights still on and one of the doors hanging open. I froze. For a split second, I considered stopping, but my dad grabbed my arm and said, "Keep driving." His voice was firm, almost scared. I glanced at him, confused, but something in his expression told me he knew stopping wasn't a good idea. The car in the ditch looked like it had been there for a while, even though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. The snow was already piling up on the roof and hood, and the open door swung back and forth in the wind, like it was inviting us, or warning us, to come closer. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the blizzard. There was no sign of the driver or any passengers, and that's what really freaked me out. Where could they have gone in this weather? We drove past slowly, and I couldn't stop staring at the car. The headlights seemed impossibly bright against the snow, casting these weird, distorted shadows on the road. I swear, as we passed, I thought I saw movement near the edge of the woods, just a flicker of something dark against the white. I didn't say anything because I wasn't even sure if I'd really seen it, or if my mind was just playing tricks on me. My dad must have seen it too, though, because he muttered, "Keep your eyes on the road," in a way that made it clear he didn't want me looking back. I wanted to ask him what he thought was out there, but I couldn't bring myself to say a word. As we put more distance between us and that car, the tension in the car only seemed to get worse. My dad kept glancing in the side mirror, like he was expecting something, or someone, to come up behind us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there. The blizzard had this eerie silence beneath the howling wind, like the world had been swallowed up, leaving just us. I wanted to convince myself that whoever had been in that car had walked to safety or maybe flagged someone down. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. In weather like this, where could they have gone so quickly? And then it happened. The headlights from behind us appeared again, cutting through the snow like some kind of ghostly beacon. I felt my chest tighten as I realized it looked like the same car, the one we just passed in the ditch. My dad didn't say anything this time, but his hand was gripping the armrest so hard his knuckles were white. The car got closer and closer, until it was right on us again, tailgating just like before. Only this time, something was different. The headlights seemed wrong, too bright, almost flickering. And even though I couldn't see the driver, I had the overwhelming sense that whoever, or whatever, was in that car wasn't human. I wanted to slam on the brakes or pull over, but my dad's voice cut through my panic. "Don't stop. Just keep driving." His tone wasn't just urgent, it was scared in a way I'd never heard before. My hands were shaking so badly that the car started to swerve slightly, but I forced myself to focus on the road. The headlights behind us didn't waver. They stayed impossibly close, like the car was glued to our bumper, but I couldn't hear an engine. Just the wind, the wipers, and my own heart pounding in my ears. I tried to convince myself it was just some reckless driver messing with us, but every instinct I had told me that wasn't it. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the car was gone. 1 second, the headlights were blindingly bright in the mirrors, and the next, they vanished into the storm. No fading away, no gradual disappearance. Just gone, like someone had flipped a switch. I blinked hard, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing, but my dad's face told me I hadn't. He looked pale, his eyes darting between the mirrors and the road ahead. "Don't look back," he said quietly, and I swear it sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't need to ask why. I didn't want to know what I might see if I did. The rest of the drive felt like an eternity. My dad didn't say another word, and I didn't dare break the silence. The storm raged on, but now it felt secondary to whatever had just happened. Every shadow in the swirling snow made my heart skip a beat, and every flicker of light made me check the mirrors, half expecting those headlights to reappear. They never did, but the tension in the car didn't ease up, not even when the glow of the town's streetlights finally cut through the storm. When we pulled into our driveway, I killed the engine and just sat there, my hands still locked around the steering wheel. My dad didn't move either, like we were both trying to process what we'd just been through. Finally, he broke the silence. "You did good out there," he said, but his voice sounded hollow, distracted. He didn't look at me when he said it, and that made it worse somehow. I wanted to ask him about the car, about what he thought we saw, or didn't see, but the words wouldn't come out. Instead, we both went inside without saying another word about it. To this day, we've never talked about what happened that night. I don't know if it was just some kind of weird coincidence or something we weren't meant to understand. All I know is, every time it snows like that, I can't help but check the mirrors, half expecting to see those headlights again. Island Ferry Ordeal. I don't know what possessed me to take that ferry ride that day. Looking back, every instinct I had screamed to stay on land, but I brushed it off as paranoia. It was supposed to be a quick trip, less than an hour across a narrow channel to a small island off the coast. The morning had been clear, even sunny, but by the time I arrived at the dock, the sky had darkened. There was a heaviness in the air, the kind you feel before a storm, but the crew seemed unfazed. "Storms come and go," one of them said with a shrug. Foolishly, I took that as reassurance and boarded. The ferry wasn't particularly big, maybe large enough for 50 people and a handful of cars, but it looked sturdy enough. As we pulled away from the dock, the wind picked up. It was sharp, almost biting, and carried a faint, salty mist that clung to my face. Within minutes, the waves began to swell. They weren't the gentle rolls I'd seen on other ferry rides. These were aggressive, slamming against the sides of the boat like they were trying to tear it apart. People around me were starting to notice too. A mother clutched her toddler a little tighter. A man near the railing leaned forward, his face pale and strained, staring at the horizon like he could will it to calm down. About 15 minutes in, the rain started. Not a drizzle, but a torrential downpour that came out of nowhere. It was like someone flipped a switch, and suddenly, the world outside the ferry turned into a chaotic blur of gray and white. The water slammed against the windows, so loud that it drowned out everything else. I couldn't see the shoreline anymore, not where we'd come from or where we were headed. People were murmuring now, some of them standing up to look around, their unease growing into visible fear. The crew, however, were doing their best to stay calm. One of them walked through the cabin, telling people to stay seated and keep calm. His voice wavered, though. and that terrified me more than the storm outside. Then the ferry lurched hard. It felt like the entire boat had been yanked backward and to the side at the same time. People screamed as drinks and bags slid across the floor. I grabbed onto the armrest of my seat so tightly my knuckles ached, and for a second, I thought the boat was going to tip over. A loud grinding noise came from below deck, followed by a series of rapid, muffled clangs. I didn't know much about boats, but that didn't sound normal. The mother with the toddler was crying now, her voice barely audible over the wind and rain. One of the crew members came running past us, heading toward the lower deck, his face pale as a sheet. Whatever was happening, it wasn't good. The next wave hit us like a truck. The boat tilted sharply to the left, throwing people from their seats. I was holding on for dear life, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Water started pouring in from somewhere, flooding the floor of the cabin. It wasn't deep, not yet, but seeing it slosh around my ankles was enough to make my stomach drop. A woman a few rows behind me screamed, and when I turned to look, I saw her pointing toward the window. The horizon had disappeared entirely. All I could see was an enormous wall of water heading straight for us. I'll never forget the sound of that wave hitting the ferry. It was deafening, like an explosion. The windows buckled, but somehow didn't break. The boat groaned, metal creaking in protest, and for a moment, I was sure we were going under. Water sprayed in from somewhere, soaking us all. People were shouting, some praying, others crying. One of the crew members tried to give instructions, but his voice was lost in the chaos. The mother with the toddler was clutching her child so tightly that I worried she might hurt him, but I couldn't blame her. I was gripping the seat in front of me so hard my fingers felt numb. Somehow, the ferry stayed upright, but the storm wasn't letting up. The wind howled like a living thing, and the rain was coming in sideways now, slashing against the windows so hard it was impossible to see outside. I kept glancing at the crew, hoping for some sign that they had this under control, but their faces told me everything I needed to know. They were scared. One of them was on a radio, shouting something I couldn't make out, while another scrambled to secure loose equipment that was sliding across the deck. Then the power went out. The lights flickered once, twice, and then the cabin plunged into darkness. For a moment, all I could hear was the storm and the panicked breathing of everyone around me. Someone screamed, and that seemed to set off a chain reaction. People started shouting, yelling for help, crying out in fear. I was frozen, gripping the armrest like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. The emergency lights came on a few seconds later, casting everything in a dim, red glow that made the cabin feel even more surreal. It was like being trapped in some kind of nightmare. With the emergency lights on, I could see the water rising faster now. It wasn't just sloshing around our ankles anymore, it was creeping up past our calves. The cabin smelled like seawater and panic. Sweat, fear, and something metallic that made my stomach churn. People were shouting at the crew, demanding to know what was going on, but no one had answers. One of the crew members yelled for everyone to put on life jackets, and that's when the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We might actually go down. I stumbled toward the nearest rack of life jackets, fumbling with the straps as my hands shook uncontrollably. A man beside me tried to help his wife into one, but they were arguing over how to secure it properly. Their voices rose above the chaos, sharp and panicked. I forced myself to focus, slipping the jacket over my head and pulling the straps tight. My mind was racing. How far were we from land? How deep was the water here? Would anyone even know where to look for us if we went under? The ferry rocked violently again, throwing me into the wall. My shoulder hit the metal so hard that pain shot down my arm, but I barely noticed. The life jacket felt like a cruel joke. What good was this thin foam vest against waves that could swallow a house? People were clinging to anything they could grab: railings, seats, each other. The mother with the toddler had strapped a life jacket onto the boy and was sobbing, her voice hoarse and desperate. I wanted to comfort her, to say something, but I couldn't even convince myself that we'd survive. Then came the worst sound of all, a deep, shuddering crack from somewhere below us. It reverberated through the entire ferry, and I swear I felt the floor shift beneath my feet. One of the crew shouted, "Brace yourselves," and a moment later, another wave slammed into us. This time, the ferry tilted so far to the side that I thought we were capsizing. People screamed as loose bags and debris flew across the cabin. My body slammed against the railing, and for a second, I was looking straight down at the churning water. The sheer power of it, the way it seemed to reach up and grab at us, was unlike anything I'd ever seen. By some miracle, the ferry righted itself, but it was clear we were losing the battle. Water was pouring in faster now, knee-high in the cabin and rising. The crew had stopped trying to calm anyone down. They were scrambling to get people toward the exits, shouting over the chaos. "We need to abandon ship," one of them yelled, his voice cracking. My stomach twisted at the words. Abandon ship? Into that storm? The thought of jumping into those black, churning waves made my entire body freeze, but there was no choice. The crew started directing us to the lifeboats, but the scene was utter chaos. People were pushing and shoving, some screaming at others to move faster, while others froze in place, too terrified to act. I fought my way toward the nearest lifeboat, gripping the railing to steady myself as the ferry continued to rock violently. When I finally got to the edge, I saw it, the lifeboat dangling precariously in the wind, being tossed like a toy on the waves below. The crew was trying to lower it, but the ropes looked like they could snap at any second. I hesitated, staring down at the water. It felt like staring into the abyss. I don't know what made me jump. Maybe it was the sheer panic around me, the screaming and the chaos, or maybe it was the realization that staying on the ferry was certain death. My body moved on instinct, and the next thing I knew, I was plunging into the icy water. The shock of it was like being hit by a wall. My chest tightened immediately, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The waves tossed me around like I was nothing, pulling me under and then spitting me back out. My life jacket kept me afloat, but it felt like the ocean itself was trying to drag me down. I gasped for air, coughing up salt water, and tried to orient myself. The ferry loomed above me, its lights barely visible through the rain and spray. I could see other people in the water, their faces pale and terrified as they clung to bits of debris or fought to reach the lifeboat. The wind was so loud it drowned out the sounds of their screams. A huge wave slammed into me, spinning me around, and for a moment, I lost sight of everything. When I surfaced again, I saw the ferry listing heavily to one side. It looked like it could go under at any moment. The ferry let out a groaning, metallic wail as it tilted even further. It was like watching a giant beast succumb to the inevitable. I saw one of the lifeboats finally hit the water, but the waves were relentless, slamming into it and nearly flipping it over. People were clinging to the sides, some managing to climb in, while others were swept away by the current. I tried to swim toward it, but the waves kept pushing me back, dragging me farther from the boat and closer to the chaos of the sinking ferry. Then it happened. The ferry gave one final lurch and began to sink, the back end disappearing beneath the waves first. The noise was deafening, metal twisting, water rushing in, people screaming. The suction as it went under was terrifying. I kicked as hard as I could, trying to stay away from the pull, but I could feel myself being dragged toward it. Debris floated all around me, wooden planks, suitcases, even a car bumper, but I couldn't focus on anything except staying above water. I don't know how I did it, but eventually the pull lessened and the ferry was gone, swallowed by the sea. After the ferry disappeared, the sea seemed even more menacing, like it had claimed its prize and wasn't done yet. The waves were still huge, crashing over us and making it almost impossible to keep my head above water. I could hear people yelling, but the storm swallowed their voices, muffling everything. My legs were burning from kicking so hard, and my arms felt useless, flailing against the relentless current. I was starting to feel the cold seep into my bones, my strength fading with every second. Out of nowhere, a piece of debris floated toward me, part of a wooden crate, big enough to hold onto. I grabbed it, wrapping my arms around it like a lifeline. It wasn't much, but it kept me afloat. I scanned the water, squinting through the rain and spray, and saw the lifeboat. It was farther away now, almost unrecognizable in the distance. A few people were still clinging to it, their silhouettes barely visible. I shouted, waving one arm, but no one noticed. The storm was too loud, and the lifeboat too far. For the first time that night, I thought I wasn't going to make it. I don't know how long I clung to that piece of wood, but it felt like hours. Every wave felt like it might be my last, each one hitting me harder than the last, soaking me to the core and making my grip weaker. My muscles ached, and my throat burned from swallowing seawater. I kept thinking about the people I'd seen earlier, the mother and her toddler, the couple trying to strap on life jackets, and wondering if they'd made it to safety. The thought of that little boy disappearing into the waves was almost too much to bear. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, I saw something in the distance. A light. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but then it flashed again, a steady, sweeping beam cutting through the rain. A searchlight. My heart jumped in my chest. I started waving frantically, screaming even though my voice was barely more than a croak. The light moved closer, and soon I could make out the shape of a rescue boat. It was still a ways off, battling the waves just like we were, but it was there. I wasn't alone. The rescue boat's light swept over me again, this time lingering for a moment. I waved with everything I had left, shouting hoarsely even though I wasn't sure they could hear me. The beam shifted, and for a terrifying second, I thought they'd missed me, but then the boat started turning in my direction. Relief surged through me, so overwhelming that I almost let go of the crate. I clung to it tighter, forcing myself to stay focused. The rescue boat fought its way toward me, its engine roaring against the storm, until it was close enough for me to see the crew silhouetted against the light. "Hold on. We're coming," someone shouted from the deck. They tossed a life ring attached to a rope, and it landed just a few feet away. I let go of the crate and reached for it, my arms trembling from exhaustion. My fingers brushed the rope, and for a second, I thought I wouldn't be able to grab it, but then I managed to wrap my hand around it. They pulled me in, the waves battering me the whole way. When I finally reached the side of the boat, strong hands grabbed my arms and hauled me aboard. The deck was slick with rain and seawater, and I collapsed onto it, coughing and gasping for air. As I lay on the deck, shivering uncontrollably, I became aware of the chaos around me. The rescue crew moved quickly, pulling others from the water and shouting instructions over the roar of the storm. I craned my neck to look around and saw that the lifeboat had been secured alongside the rescue vessel. Survivors were being helped aboard, soaked to the bone and wide-eyed with shock. I searched the faces for anyone familiar, the mother, the toddler, the couple, but it was hard to tell who had made it and who hadn't. My chest tightened at the thought of how many must have been lost. The storm began to ease as the boat turned back toward the mainland. The waves were still rough, but the rain was letting up, and the wind wasn't as fierce. Someone draped a heavy blanket over my shoulders, and I clung to it, though it did little to chase away the cold. I stared out at the dark water, half expecting to see the ferry resurface, as if none of it had really happened. But all that was left were bits of debris bobbing on the surface, scattered like wreckage from a nightmare. I still don't know how I survived, or why I did when so many didn't. The memory of that night has never left me. Those waves, that sound of the ferry going under, the sheer terror of the unknown. Even now, I can't look at the ocean without feeling its pull, like it's waiting to take me back.